I became concerned about how the FDA's evaluation of whether a medication works had gotten a little bit looser than one might hope in terms of them giving a pass to drugs that, in the eyes of many of us, had not really been shown to work. There's been an issue for a lot of years about whether FDA has been using pathways that were designed to speed drugs to market, but using it perhaps in ways that were never intended by the people who devised those pathways in the 1990s.
Okay. And on a general basis, why should the general public care?
That's a good question. I believe that when a patient gets a medication from their doctor or nurse practitioner, they assume that somebody has looked very carefully at this drug and determined that it is indeed effective for the purposes for which it's being given to you, and that it's reasonably safe.
Okay.
And I frankly think a lot of us doctors believe that that's all kind of taken care of as well. And under a lot of pressure from the pharmaceutical industry over the last decade or so, the FDA has gotten perhaps a little bit too permissive in giving a drug a label of approved, even when all that was really demonstrated was that it made a small change in a lab test that may or may not correlate with improving a patient's health. And so that's the kind of rethinking that, frankly, I think a lot of us doctors don't think about as much as we ought to. We just assume that the FDA is out there doing its thing and making sure that all the drugs work. And by work, we all think that means if a patient's got a disease, it will make that disease better or it'll prevent a given problem. And that's the way that FDA has deviated a bit from its original mission over the last 10 or 15 years.
You talk in the beginning of the book about this program called accelerated approval, and you kind of point that as an initial culprit. Tell us about that.
Well, it started, as many problematic things do, with the very best of intentions. And the scene goes back to the late 80s, early 90s, when the AIDS epidemic was at its height. And there was a lot of concern that the approval mechanism that the FDA had put in place in the 1960s, which really became the model for the world. But when the AIDS epidemic hit in the late 80s and early 90s, there was a concern that that degree of carefulness might have become a little too cumbersome. And the argument was getting made that we needed a better way, given that people were dying at the height of the AIDS epidemic at alarming rates,
right,
to say, well, we don't really know how well this drug works, but it kind of looks promising. Let's let it out there. And that made perfect sense in that time. So FDA created this pathway called accelerated approval, and it made a lot of sense. It was kind of a social contract with the country. And the FDA said, we will allow this drug on the market, even though its manufacturer hasn't shown that it really helps patients, but it makes a lab test look better. And if we're dealing with people with terminal cancer or AIDS, we want to give them a chance to have this drug, especially if it doesn't seem to be terribly dangerous. And then we'll ask the manufacturer, in exchange for that deal where we'll let you market the drug before you've shown that it works, we'll let them put the drug on the market, and then they will do the follow-up studies to see if the drugs did more than just make a lab test look better or make an imaging study look better, but actually extended either the quality of life or length of life or health state of patients. I mean, that's why we take drugs. We're prescribed drugs. And the difficulty was that that standard then started to get applied to a lot of other conditions where all the drug did was make a small change in a lab test called a surrogate measure. And then the manufacturer never came back and did the mandated follow-up studies it was supposed to do to show that the drug really helped patients. And that's really where that particular pathway has gone off the rails.
Well, you mentioned that one of the things that's supposed to happen on accelerated approval is that there continues to be ongoing testing. But it sounds like oftentimes that testing is just not occurring as part of what the agreed upon process is.
That is exactly right, Paul. And that is where the system falls apart. There's nothing wrong with saying, we don't know if this drug really works. It looks promising. This is a fatal disease. Let's put it out there and keep studying it. But the and keep studying it part is where that social contract falls apart.
Okay.
The FDA kind of requests the companies to do follow-up studies. It even commands them to do so. But in what is sometimes looks from the outside like a pretty cynical ploy, the companies just don't get around to getting those tests done. And yet they can keep the drug on the market, charge full price for it, and yet it's not clearly doing any good for anybody except the shareholders of that company.
Okay. And there are drugs, as you've mentioned, that are shown not to work well, but does that mean there's a steady stream of drugs being taken off the market?
Unfortunately, that is not the case. Even when those things either fail to replicate or flunk their follow-up studies, they remain on the market because it is very, very hard for the FDA to persuade a company to stop making and selling its drug.
All right. There is a cold medicine story, if I recall, right? That kind of goes along with this.
Right. Phenylephrine is what you're referring to. And I bet that most listeners have it in their medicine cabinet, and it's been there for years. It was the successor to actually a very effective cold remedy that you could get over the counter called pseudoephedrine, or the brand name was Sudafed.
Uh-huh.
And that worked great. If you had a stuffy nose and you were congested and you wanted to take something to dry yourself out, it worked beautifully. The problem with pseudoephedrine or Sudafed was that it turned out that people who were clever backyard chemists were able to figure out a way to make it into crystal meth.
Yes,
and this became a big cottage industry in some parts of the country. And so the FDA said, we can't have people going in and buying boxfuls of pseudoephedrine and turning it into meth. So let's make it hard to get. And yet the manufacturer said, well, we got a good trade name here in Sudafed, and everybody asks for Sudafed. Let's just keep the Sudafed trade name, but let's replace the pseudoephedrine with another chemical called phenylephrine, which sounds like a neat idea, except that phenylephrine does not do anything. Study after study has shown that it does not help with congestion. We're not talking about life and death diseases here, but when an American goes into a drugstore and says, I've got this, congestion in my nose that's driving me nuts, and they buy something that is still called Sudafed, that used to contain the real active ingredient, now contains a completely useless ingredient, but it's got the same trade name, and they buy it, it's not doing any good. And what troubles me is not that phenylephrine is dangerous, but what troubles me is that they could be taking something that actually is effective, but they're spending millions and millions of dollars a year, collectively on something that doesn't work. And FDA has been unable thus far to get it off the market, even though it has been shown to be ineffective.
Well, one of the studies you did was a follow-up study, talked about drugs that were approved on behalf or on the basis of something that is called PFS. Explain to me, if you will, what PFS is.
Sure. Again, it's and this is where it gets complicated, but since lives are at stake, it's worth pushing on to talk about it in detail. PFS stands for progression-free survival. And on the face of it, it's something that we doctors and most patients, feel like that's a good thing. It's demonstrating that in a patient with cancer, their imaging studies like their MRI or their CAT scan are not getting worse, or their counts are not getting worse. And on the face of it, that seems like a good thing. And a drug ought to be approved, at least initially, if it can prolong so-called progression-free survival. The problem is that progression-free survival sometimes, but often not, may not predict actual patient survival. That is, your labs may look good, your imaging studies may look good, but you don't live any longer than you would have either with no drug or with another drug. And so I argue, as have many oncologists, that we should not be so enamored of the idea of progression-free survival as the final word on whether a cancer drug ought to be approved. And we need to say, okay, that gets you in the door. It's plausible. We should make it available for people who need it. Let's keep studying it. But in the FDA's hands, that becomes the kind of final part of the story for too many drugs. The drug's approved, and we never find out whether this progression-free survival increase is associated with longer life expectancy, or sometimes, as it is, with shorter life expectancy. And we sure as hell don't want that.
That's absolutely true. Well, one of the common topics that we find ourselves spending a lot of time on, big brains, is Alzheimer's.
Right.
And so the concept of amyloid plaque has come up with some frequency. And there's a case of a medication that was designed to treat amyloid plaque that also kind of makes this case.
Right, exactly. And the drug was called Aduhelm, was the trade name, and the more
Have you noticed
unpronounceable.
my tricky way of not mentioning the name, so you mention it first? It's working for me so far.
Okay, fine. I'll even at no extra charge give you the unpronounceable generic name,
Thank
which
you.
is aducanumab.
Got
And
it. Good for you.
Yeah, you'll notice that all the generic names are much harder to remember and pronounce than the trade names. And this was really a low point for FDA. In fact, my colleague Aaron Kesselheim, who works with me at Harvard and leads a lot of this work, and I had an op-ed in the Times when this debacle occurred, saying that this was the worst decision FDA has ever made. And hearing about it really, I think, should give us pause about the way FDA sometimes makes its decisions. Aduhelm was subjected to a lot of studies by its manufacturer, and you got to give them credit. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars on randomized placebo-controlled studies. It's a drug you have to take every other week intravenously, so it's arduous for the patient.
And
it
crazy
also,
expensive.
yes, yeah, $56,000 was the initial list price of the drug per patient per year. And also, it was demonstrated to cause occasional brain swelling and brain bleeding. Now, all of that might be something one would be willing to consider a okay trade-off if it actually helped with Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm.
But the crushing irony here is that Aduhelm did not improve the cognition or even slow the deterioration, importantly, of patients who had Alzheimer's disease. And in a bit of kind of regulatory jujitsu that appalled many people, the FDA, when its advisory committee of outside experts came in and said, let's look at the data, because the company had previously given the drug up for dead. Its statistician said, no, there's no evidence from all these clinical trials that this drug does any good. But they had some back channel meetings with FDA in ways that they probably shouldn't have. And they figured out a way to look at the data in a manner that might suggest that it helped people. And I quote this famous statement among all of us who look at drug results, which is that if you torture data long enough, you can get it to say whatever you want it to say.
Yep.
And so there was a lot of data torturing, but even in the face of that, the outside advisory committee concluded there was no evidence this drug helped patients with Alzheimer's to either have less memory impairment or even help them deteriorate more slowly, which would have been okay if it did that.
And if I recall, there not only did it not work, but there were some pretty impactful side effects.
Absolutely, Paul. It can make your brain bleed, and people have had strokes while taking this drug, and it can cause swelling in the brain. So it's not nothing.
Right.
And again, as somebody who did a lot of geriatric medicine work for many years at Harvard, I also know that it's not a small thing to have an elderly patient with cognitive impairment come in every 2 weeks for an hour-long intravenous infusion. So it was burdensome both in terms of the risk, in terms of the going through the studies. You had to get multiple MRIs of your head, which is kind of scary if you're a confused older person to have your head stuck in an MRI machine for 20 minutes. And by the way, it can also make your brain bleed. So it ought to be pretty damn good if we're going to accept that degree of risk.
Gosh,
and burden.
no kidding.
Not to mention the cost, which was enough. Somebody calculated that had the drug been used as it was originally priced for all the people that FDA said it was good for, the annual expenditure would have been the size of the entire budget for NASA. So, these were many billions of dollars. Now, I guess if there's a good side of the story, when there was an uproar that FDA said, okay, well, it doesn't really meet its clinical benchmarks, but retroactively, we're going to approve it because it lowers the amyloid level in your brain, which was never the criterion that it was to be evaluated, but it was one of these surrogate measures. And there was an uproar. Dr. Kesselheim and two other members of the advisory committee quit in protest. A lot of healthcare systems, including my own at Harvard Medical School, decided they were not going to give it or pay for it. And then the coup de grace happened when the Medicare program looked at the data itself. Now, until then, the Medicare program always paid for anything FDA approved. They said, you guys do the evaluation and approval, we'll do the paying.
Yep.
But the approval decision was so egregious and the cost was so astronomical that Medicare said, we're not going to pay for this. And because it already had caused an increase prospectively in the premiums that every older person who is in the Part B drug benefit program in Medicare would have had to pay. So it already was having a financial shadow over the whole Medicare system. And once Medicare said, "Hey, we're not going to cover the cost of this drug," and all these other healthcare systems and insurers and geriatricians said, "We're not going to use this drug," it ended up dying of its own weight. But it was not FDA's finest hour, because had we gone with what FDA decided based on this surrogate outcome of it lowers your brain amyloid levels, we would have a drug that was doing no good, causing strokes, being a massive burden economically and clinically, and it would have been out there to this day.